Millionaire CEO, shocked after finding a young girl cleaning school bathroom alone. It was a chilly evening when Alexander Hayes stepped out of his sleek car and walked through the gates of his childhood school, the place where his journey had once begun. The campus looked different now, renovated in some areas, but the soul of the old building still lingered in the air. His footsteps echoed against the long, empty hallways, each tap reminding him of the boy he once was. He had come that night only to check on a donation project his company had funded, but as he moved deeper into the corridors, something unexpected pulled his attention away from business. Somewhere ahead, faint and rhythmic, came a sound, soft but persistent, breaking the silence of the deserted school. Alexander paused, his brow furrowing, then followed the sound cautiously. The dim fluorescent lights above flickered, throwing shadows across the worn-out walls, and with each step the noise grew sharper, clearer, until he recognized it. It was the sound of scrubbing. He slowed his pace, curiosity mingling with unease, and soon found himself standing before a bathroom door slightly ajar. Light spilled weakly through the crack, and the smell of strong cleaning chemicals drifted into the hall. Carefully, he pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, and in that instant the sight before him froze him to the ground. A little girl, no older than 9, was kneeling on the cold, wet tiles, scrubbing the bathroom floor with her small, trembling hands. She wore an oversized dress, faded and patched in several places, hanging loosely from her thin frame. Her hair fell across her damp forehead, sticking to her skin as she bent forward to work. Beside her sat a rusty bucket filled with murky water, and in her fragile grip was a rag so worn it looked ready to fall apart. For a moment, Alexander couldn't move. His breath caught in his chest as disbelief washed over him. A child, here, alone, forced into such exhausting work. He had witnessed struggles in boardrooms, seen men fight for money and power, but nothing compared to this heartbreaking scene. His gaze traveled to her knees, pressed hard into the floor, leaving faint red marks on her skin, and to her bare feet, resting directly on the cold tiles. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in her task, scrubbing with a determination that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. Each stroke of her hand was firm, almost desperate, as if she believed her work carried a weight far beyond just cleaning. Alexander's chest tightened painfully. The oversized dress told him she hadn't owned clothes of her size in a long time. The rawness of her small fingers told him this wasn't the first time she had done such work, and the silence of the room told him she was used to being unseen. A wave of guilt and sorrow hit him as he thought of his own comfortable life, his mansion, his staff, his daughter's laughter in a warm home. And then he looked back at this child, her tiny frame bent under invisible burdens. He leaned against the doorframe, his thoughts racing, questions colliding in his mind, yet none escaping his lips. The scene had stolen his words, leaving him with only a heavy silence. At last, the floor creaked under his weight, and the girl froze mid-scrub. Slowly, she turned her head, her wide, dark eyes lifting to meet his. They were filled with fear, with exhaustion, and with the kind of maturity no child should carry. For a second she seemed ready to run, her body tense like a bird about to take flight. Alexander raised his hand gently and whispered, "It's okay. Don't be afraid." His voice, usually commanding in business meetings, softened into something almost unfamiliar to himself. The rag slipped from her hand, splash-ing into the bucket, and her little fingers curled nervously into her lap. He wanted to speak again, to demand answers, to understand why she was there, but his throat tightened, refusing to form the questions. The sight of her fragile figure was overwhelming. He had walked into this school expecting to review progress, yet what he had found instead was a truth that struck deeper than any corporate struggle ever could. At that moment, he was not a millionaire CEO. He was simply a man standing in front of a sight that shattered his heart. Alexander took a careful step forward, his polished shoes making the slightest sound against the damp tiles, and the little girl instinctively flinched as though she were used to being scolded for things she hadn't even done. He immediately softened his posture, lowering himself slightly so he wouldn't tower over her small frame. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" he asked gently, his voice almost trembling. For a moment, the girl hesitated, her lips pressing tightly together as her wide eyes studied his face, searching for some clue of whether he was safe or dangerous. Her tiny hands fidgeted nervously with the hem of her oversized dress, and then, in a small voice, she whispered, I clean here after school." The words seemed to break the heavy silence of the room, each one landing on Alexander's heart like a weight he couldn't lift. He blinked, not sure he had heard her right, and leaned in closer, his expression soft but concerned. "Why?" he asked carefully, not out of disbelief, but out of a deep, aching need to understand. The girl swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the bucket at her side as if it could shield her from judgment. "My mom is sick," she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry the truth. "And I helped the janitor, so we can afford medicine." The words fell from her lips with an innocence that pierced him more than any harsh reality he had ever faced. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't crying. She was simply explaining, as though this burden was normal for her, as though this was just life. Alexander felt something stir in his chest, something raw and painful. His throat tightened, and to his shock, he felt tears forming in his eyes, blurring the harsh fluorescent light above. He quickly blinked, but the sting remained. He had weathered countless storms in business, fought ruthless rivals, and seen empires collapse, but never had he been confronted with such purity, forced into such hardship. His gaze lingered on her small hands, reddened from work, and on the way her shoulders sagged beneath a weight far too great for someone her age. "What's your name?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the silence again. The girl glanced up cautiously, her lashes wet with unshed tears, and replied, "Emily." The name rang in his ears, simple yet powerful, and he repeated it silently, as if engraving it into his heart. "Emily," he said aloud, his tone filled with warmth and sorrow all at once. She nodded timidly, clutching the rag in her lap like it was the only thing tethering her to strength. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he feared frightening her, so he simply stayed where he was, lowering his voice even more. "Emily, you shouldn't have to do this," he whispered, though he knew she might not understand why he was saying it. Her big eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something. Was it defiance? Or perhaps the fragile pride of someone who refused to break despite everything? "It's okay," she murmured quietly, almost as if to reassure him instead of herself. "I'm strong. I can help." Those words shattered him in ways he could not describe. A child, who should have been playing, laughing, running with friends, was instead here, convincing herself that being strong meant scrubbing floors so her mother could live. Alexander's heart ached in silence, and he had to look away for a moment to compose himself. The sharp smell of cleaning chemicals stung his nose, but it was nothing compared to the sting in his chest. When he looked back at Emily, she was already dipping the rag back into the bucket, ready to continue her work, as if the conversation had already ended. "Wait," Alexander said quickly, his voice tender but urgent. She froze, rag dripping in her hand, her eyes rising once more to meet his. "You don't have to keep cleaning right now. You've done enough," he told her gently. Emily's brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across her face. She tilted her head and asked softly, "But if I don't, who will?" The innocence of that question, so simple yet profound, sent another wave of emotion crashing through him. He struggled to keep his composure, forcing a small smile, though his heart was breaking. "Someone else will, Emily," he said in a hushed tone, though he wasn't even sure who that someone else was. What mattered in that moment was that she believed him. She lowered the rag slowly, her small hand trembling as if she were releasing not just a piece of cloth, but the burden of an entire world she had carried far too long. Alexander's chest rose and fell heavily as he watched her, feeling the sting of his tears finally spill over. He brushed them quickly, not wanting to alarm her, but the truth was clear. He had never in his life felt so powerless and so determined all at once. In that quiet bathroom, with nothing but a bucket, a rag, and a child who carried courage beyond her years, Alexander Hayes felt his entire world tilt, as though fate had just placed before him a test he could not ignore. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the rag she had just set down, her eyes lowering to the floor, as though the weight of her words was too heavy to look him in the eye. Alexander stayed silent, giving her the space to continue, sensing that behind her timid voice lay a story far too big for a child to carry. After a long pause, Emily spoke again, each word careful, fragile, yet steady in its truth. "My dad. He died," she whispered, her voice so faint that Alexander had to lean closer to hear. Her lips trembled slightly, but she pressed on, forcing the words out with a strength that startled him. "After he was gone, Mama got sick. She can't get out of bed anymore." Her small shoulders shifted as she spoke, as if trying to bear the invisible weight of her family's survival all on her own. Alexander felt his chest tighten painfully, a knot forming in his throat as the image of her mother, frail and confined to a bed, painted itself vividly in his mind. Emily continued, her tone matter-of-fact, as if she had told herself this story so many times it had become routine. "Nobody helps us, so I help the janitor. He gives me a few coins, sometimes food, enough to buy Mama's medicine, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she bit her lip, her eyes glistening under the dim light. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with truths that should never belong to a child. Alexander wanted to say something, anything, but no words came, only the sting of tears pressing against his eyes. Emily glanced up at him then, and in that moment, instead of despair, she offered him something that broke him even more, a smile. It was small, fragile, yet astonishingly brave. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness that felt almost unreal in the face of her pain. "I just want my mom to get better." Those words pierced Alexander's heart like nothing else ever had. He thought of his own daughter, her room filled with toys, her laughter echoing through a home that lacked for nothing, and the comparison tore him apart inside. His daughter asked for dolls, for dresses, for holidays by the sea. Emily asked only for her mother's health. He swallowed hard, feeling the sharp edge of guilt press against his soul. And for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes, who had faced cutthroat competitors without blinking, felt utterly powerless. He studied Emily's face, the way her eyes still held light despite everything, and he realized he was staring at courage in its purest form. The silence stretched between them, filled with his unspoken grief for her suffering. The sound of dripping water from the faucet echoed through the room, each drop marking the passage of a truth he could not escape. He thought about the empire he had built, the countless meetings, the endless pursuit of wealth, and how meaningless it all seemed when compared to the quiet strength of this child kneeling before him. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Her bravery demanded to be seen. His chest rose and fell heavily, each breath reminding him of how unfair the world could be. The contrast burned in his mind. His daughter tucked safely into a warm bed at home, and Emily, barefoot on the cold tiles, smiling through her suffering. The unfairness was like a knife twisting inside him, and he clenched his fists slightly, struggling to contain the storm building within. Yet Emily sat there calmly, her rag resting in the bucket, her eyes shining with a hope that defied the darkness of her story. Alexander blinked away the tears threatening to fall, knowing that the girl before him had just shaken the foundations of his heart in a way no boardroom battle ever could. Alexander left the school that night with his heart heavier than it had ever been, the image of Emily's fragile smile etched permanently into his mind. Sleep evaded him, and the luxurious comfort of his home felt strangely hollow as he lay awake, replaying her words over and over. By morning, his decision was made. He arrived back at the school not as the untouchable CEO everyone admired, but as a man who had been shaken to his core. His tailored suit felt less like a symbol of power and more like armor he no longer needed. Walking into the principal's office, he wasted no me with pleasantries. His voice was steady, but carried an urgency that brooked no delay as he explained what he had witnessed. The principal listened in stunned silence, her eyes wide as Alexander spoke of the little girl forced to scrub bathrooms after hours. Without hesitation, he demanded arrangements for immediate support. Emily's family needed help, and he was prepared to see that it was given. The principal, caught between shock and relief, agreed quickly, her tone filled with gratitude as she promised cooperation. But Alexander knew promises weren't enough. He needed to see the reality with his own eyes. Later that afternoon, he followed the directions Emily had quietly given him the night before. The streets grew narrower, the houses more worn, until he found himself standing before a small, weather-beaten home. Its roof sagged in places, the walls stained with years of neglect, and the sight struck him harder than he had expected. He knocked gently, and after a moment, a frail voice called out weakly from inside. Pushing the creaking door open, he stepped into a dimly lit room. The air was thick with the scent of medicine and the faint mustiness of poverty. On a narrow bed in the corner lay a woman, Emily's mother. Her face was pale, her body thin, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to adjust the thin blanket covering her. Alexander froze at the threshold, his heart aching at the sight. This was the woman Emily had spoken of, the one she had been fighting so hard for. The mother's tired eyes lifted to him, confusion flickering as she took in the sight of a well-dressed stranger standing in her home. Alexander removed his coat, suddenly feeling the weight of it, and stepped forward with quiet respect. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked gently. She nodded faintly, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Emily appeared from a small adjoining room, her eyes lighting up with surprise and worry. She rushed to her mother's side, her small hand slipping into her mother's weak grasp. Alexander stood there for a long moment, taking it all in, the peeling paint on the walls, the empty shelves, the air of exhaustion that hung over the entire home. His chest tightened, and without even realizing it, he clenched his jaw. He had seen poor conditions before, but never with such a personal weight pressing on him. This wasn't just poverty. This was a family quietly crumbling under the weight of illness and loss. Kneeling beside the bed, he spoke softly to Emily's mother, his voice breaking with sincerity. "You don't know me, but I promise you this. Your daughter will not have to carry this burden alone." The woman's eyes glistened with tears, her frail fingers tightening slightly around her daughter's hand as if clinging to the hope he offered. Emily looked between them, her expression a mixture of confusion and wonder, not fully understanding but sensing the gravity of his words. In that moment, Alexander felt something shift within himself. This was no longer about charity or obligation. This was about humanity, about responsibility, about answering the call that life had placed directly into his hands. He rose slowly, his eyes scanning the small room once more, and silently vowed that he would not rest until this family's suffering was eased. For the first time in years, his mission had nothing to do with profits or success. It was about saving lives, about restoring dignity, about ensuring a little girl never again had to scrub floors to buy her mother's medicine. True to his vow, Alexander wasted no time turning his promises into action. Within just a few days, the changes began to unfold like sunlight breaking through a storm. Professional caregivers were brought in to look after Emily's mother, tending to her with compassion and skill that immediately eased the strain on the family. The once dim and lifeless home slowly began to feel lighter as medicine, fresh food, and warmth filled the space that had so long been empty of comfort. Emily watched it all unfold with wide eyes, hardly believing what she was seeing. Her tiny frame no longer bent under exhaustion, her little hands no longer red from scrubbing floors. She began to look more like the child she truly was. Alexander also arranged for them to move into a more comfortable home, a modest but safe and welcoming place where Emily and her mother could breathe without fear of hunger or sickness shadowing every day. For the first time in years, Emily slept in a bed that didn't creak with every movement, under blankets that were warm and soft, with the faint hum of safety in the air. One afternoon, as Alexander visited to see how they were settling in, Emily clutched his hand and looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Does this mean I don't have to clean anymore?" she whispered, her voice trembling as if she were afraid the answer might vanish into the air. Alexander felt his heart swell at her innocence, at the way her question revealed just how deeply those years of burden had scarred her childhood. He crouched down to meet her gaze, his smile warm and steady, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying both reassurance and love. "From now on, your only job is to study, dream, and be happy." The words seemed to wrap around her like a blanket of safety, and for the first time, her lips curled into a genuine smile, bright, unburdened, and radiant with a joy she had almost forgotten how to feel. Her laughter, small and fragile, filled the room like music, and Alexander realized it was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Emily threw her arms around him, clinging tightly as if to anchor herself to the miracle that had entered her life. Her mother, watching from the bed with tears in her eyes, whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, her heart lighter, knowing her daughter no longer had to bear the weight of survival alone. Each visit from Alexander became a moment of happiness for Emily, who began to blossom with the assurance that her future was no longer trapped in darkness. Books replaced rags, pencils replaced buckets, and dreams replaced fears. She spent her evenings now with homework spread before her, her brows furrowed in concentration, and Alexander couldn't help but feel a deep pride as he watched her grow into the child she was always meant to be. The house echoed with a new kind of sound, Emily's voice reciting lessons, her laughter carrying through the rooms, her mother's gentle hums of hope. The transformation was almost unreal, and yet it was there in every corner, in every breath of peace that filled their days. Alexander found himself lingering during his visits, not as a benefactor overseeing a project, but as someone who genuinely cared, as someone who felt a sense of belonging with this small family. Each time Emily looked up at him with those wide, grateful eyes, he was reminded that sometimes the greatest successes in life came not from boardrooms or contracts, but from moments like these, where love, kindness, and humanity created something money alone never could. Time passed gently, and the seasons shifted as if marking the quiet rebirth of Emily's world. Months later, the once timid little girl now walked into school with her head held higher, her books clutched proudly in her arms, her smile no longer shadowed by exhaustion or worry. Teachers began to notice her eagerness, the way her hand shot up to answer questions, her laughter mingling with the voices of other children as she played freely during recess. She was thriving, her spirit blooming like a flower finally touched by sunlight. At home, her mother was slowly regaining strength, her cheeks no longer pale, her voice growing steadier with each passing day as the treatment took effect. The sound of her soft laughter returned to the house, a melody Emily had longed for through the darkest nights. And through it all, Alexander remained a constant presence, not as the wealthy CEO whose name filled newspapers, but as a man who had found a deeper purpose. He would arrive quietly, sometimes with books for Emily, sometimes with fresh flowers for her mother, and each time Emily's footsteps would come rushing down the hallway the moment she heard his voice. "My guardian angel," she would cry, throwing her arms around him with the purest joy. The words melted his heart every time, each syllable reminding him that a chance encounter in a lonely school bathroom had altered the course of not only Emily's life, but his own. He had entered that evening as a businessman checking on a project, but he had walked away with a responsibility that no board meeting or contract could ever compare to. standing in their modest but warm home, watching Emily recite her lessons aloud with a glow in her eyes. Alexander felt a quiet pride unlike any he had ever known. The empire he had built suddenly seemed small when measured against the laughter of this one little girl and the gratitude in her mother's smile. His heart swelled with a truth he could no longer deny. Wealth was never about numbers in a bank. It was about the lives you touched, the love you gave, the hope you restored. Emily's mother often called him a blessing, whispering through tears of gratitude that she could never repay what he had done. But Alexander only shook his head gently each time, insisting that the true gift was what Emily had given him. A reminder of humanity, of purpose, of what it truly meant to be alive. As weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger, not defined by charity or obligation, but by something far deeper, something that felt like family. Alexander found himself looking forward to their visits more than any corporate victory. The simple moments of sharing tea, listening to Emily's stories from school, or sitting quietly as the evening sun poured golden light into their little home. For a man who once believed success was measured by power and prestige, this was a revelation he had never expected. That one moment in the school bathroom, that glimpse of a small child scrubbing away her innocence, had forever changed his compass. He realized he had been chasing wealth all his life, but true wealth was here, in love, in kindness, in the bonds that outlasted everything else. As Emily's laughter filled the room again, clear and unrestrained, Alexander Hayes smiled to himself, knowing with certainty that he had finally discovered the richest treasure of all.